Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Anna Defina. Welcome to our webinar. I am the chair of the Italian department at Georgetown, and this event, which is part of a series of initiatives to celebrate Black History Month, is co-organized by my department and the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. This initiative, under the auspices of Georgetown College, aims to foster dialogues and collaborations across departments, inspired by the integrative and inclusive educational mission of our university. The event is co-sponsored by the Department of African American Studies and the African Studies program at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. So first I'm going to present, to introduce our guest and our discussion panel, and then I will give you some information on how to participate in the webinar. So I'm very honored and happy to introduce Maaza Mengiste. Maaza was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and lived in Nigeria and in Kenya before moving to the United States. She's a novelist and an essayist whose work examines the individual lives at stake during migration, war, and exile, and considers the intersections of photography and violence. She's an award-winning novelist. Her first novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books, was named one of the best books of 2010 by the Boston Globe and other publications. Her second novel, The Shadow King, which is the focus of today's talk, was shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize and was a 2020 LA Times Book Prize fiction finalist. Um, It was called A Lyrical Remarkable New Novel by the New York Times, and it takes readers to 1935 Ethiopia during Mussolini's invasion. It revolves around an army of ordinary women, since left out of the historical record, who joined the front line to fight against the fascists. Maaza Mengiste is the winner of the 2020 Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and her honors include the Creative Capital Award, a Fulbright Scholarship, and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and Peterborough Festival of International Literature and Culture. She was also runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Beneath the Lion's Gaze. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, the Granta, the Guardian, the New York Times, Rolling Stones, BBC Radio, and Lettres Internationales, among other places. Maaza currently serves on the board of Words Without Borders and Warscapes and lectures on creative writing at Princeton. She's also a member of Black Artists for Freedom, and her new book is a brief portrait of small death, a novel set in Berlin during the interwar years. So we're very eager to listen to her, but before that, let me introduce our panel. Our panel will present some ideas and questions to Maaza, and it's confirmed by Professor Laura Benedetti, who is the Laura and Gaetano De Sole Professor of Contemporary Italian Culture in the Department of Italian, Dayo Gore, Associate Professor of African American Studies in the Department of African American Studies, Nicoletta Pireddu, who is the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative and professor of comparative literature, and Lara Smith, associate professor in the African Study Program and the Department of Government Director at the African Studies Program in the SFS. So we will first have a presentation by Maaza, and then the panel members will ask their questions. And we will reserve some time for question answer session at the end. So please use the question answer session function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and you can do so throughout the presentation. So at this point, I'm delighted to pass the virtual microphone back to Maaza Mengiste. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, Georgetown, to all of you for inviting me, Nicoletta, Anna, Laura, Lara, Candace, Dio, everyone. I'm really grateful. I remember reading a draft of this book before it was published, I believe maybe 2 years ago. I don't even remember now exactly how long ago. This pandemic has really warped my sense of time, but I know it was before it was published. So it feels really nice to be here again. I'm going to start off by reading two very short sections from my novel, and if there's any time I can read maybe another short section, but I'm going to start off by talking or reading about Aster, who is one of the main characters in my novel. At this point in the book, she is galvanizing women as the war is preparing to start. And I'm going to just read, and then we can, hopefully it makes sense, and then you can ask me questions afterwards, if not. Aster is a glorious figure astride her horse Bunna. She has loosened her braids, and thick strands of hair fall against her neck and spread like a dark curtain around her sunlit face. She snaps the animal to a trot across the crest of the hill, her cape fanning around her figure, the golden clasp trapping flints of afternoon light. Women, she shouts. Sisters, are you listening to me? Her voice rises into the sky, a blade slicing through the valley below, startling the women from their tasks, forcing them to lift their heads and turn in her direction. Sisters, are you ready for what's to come? Ethiopia's gifted Asmari will sing of this day for years to come, of how the women drop their baskets and their jugs, how they push away their homes, their looms and piles of wool. They rise to their feet nearly in unison, unaware of their own glory, and lift their faces toward Aster's voice. That they pause long enough to listen to the soft tap of distant gunfire is a detail that the songs will repeat again and again. The musicians will make of the women's frowns a forewarning of what's to come. The singers will use the women's gasps and exclamations as signs of their growing strength. One Asmari after the next will sing these words as they play their masinko. That first battle cry was already forming in the women's throats. Aster knew she just needed a way to usher it out. The women were ready but did not know it. There were bullets to be made and gunpowder to mix and rifles to load and enemies to shoot. Women, those who can make bullets, come to me. Aster's voice carries across the valley before breaking into echoes and scattering into the horizon. She is one woman. She is many women. She is all the sound that exists in the world. And then I will move now to a section with Hirut, spoken by the chorus, which is another voice that goes through. And Hirut is a servant in the home of Aster and Aster's husband, Kidane. Her gun, which was her most prized possession, has been taken away from her in order to give to a soldier for the war effort. And this scene, told by the chorus, takes place after one attempt that Hirut makes to take the gun back. Chorus. The girl. She does not see the doomed path that opens so easily before her. She cannot foresee what is only natural, that all of Kidana's guilt-ridden weight will pivot toward the open space her rebelliousness lays bare, and he will force his way in. What is this? He is saying as he drags her away from the cave and toward the center of the camp. What is this, we say? So she will turn and put that gun back where it belongs. But she cannot know that grief cradles at the breast of cruelty, and it hungers for more, and she is for the taking. There she is, hurtling forward in his grip, a cursed keeper of promises. She notes the disappearing fog and believes it is simply the wind. She ignores the blackbirds that soar above her head in broken formation. She simply moves toward that dead campfire with her old gun slung across her back, trapped by Kidane's momentum. At the campfire pit, Aster, draped in a blanket waiting for her husband, her face hidden in its folds. Seifu and Aklilu in their shama, waiting obediently for their commander. She will not remember them. She will not recall the way Aster shrinks at the sight of her. There will be no memory of Seifu's troubled gaze or the shaking hand Aklilu has to hide by clenching both into fists. What she will note as she thinks back to that moment when she was still the same as when she was born, the crooked path of pale sunlight falling across the leaning, flat-topped tree. And I will stop there for now. I will, it's strange, sometimes strange for me to hold this book because I can't believe it's done after so many years. But it feels in many ways like a project of a lifetime, because the stories that make up the framework of this war came to me as a child through the stories that my family would tell around a table when we were eating dinner. Someone would walk into our home in the middle of a dinner party or come for tea or visit my grandparents. And they were often identified by either whose child they were who fought in this war, or whose descendant, or what they actually did during that moment. I always associated my neighbors in some way with this moment in history. I associated my grandfather and my grandmother with this moment. I was so grounded in it. The idea that there were men in Ethiopia who rose up with their outdated guns and with their spears, and sometimes with nothing but just ingenuity and their wit. And they confronted one of the most advanced militaries in the world at that time, Italy. And after 5 years, they won. They were not supposed to win, and they did. So I was hearing stories of defiance. I was hearing stories of bravery and courage. These men in my mind who were dressed in white because they had no uniforms and would rush down these hills, easy targets for snipers, became for me mythic and legendary. I carried them with me in my mind when I had to migrate from Ethiopia to the United States because of a revolution in Ethiopia. And in moments when American students or American teachers were telling me that I didn't have a history because I was African, or I poor me because I was African, I would often think about these men, these stories that I had heard that were in my own family, and say my history is better than anything these people have. It sustained me. So it felt, the story grew in my head as I got older. And I remember one particular moment when I was in high school, and a teacher gave me Homer's Iliad to read. And those battle scenes just clicked into place with my own imaginings of this war. As I started moving into my adult life and started thinking about writing as a possibility for myself, as I started thinking about the revolution or this book, The Shadow King, which would be The Shadow King, this history, you know, which one would I like to do if I could possibly write a book? I knew that this work with the Italian War would take a long time, and so I decided to instead work on this thing that also felt very close and very immediate, which is a book set during the revolution. But while I was writing that book, I started learning Italian so that I could do my own research into the archives in Italy. I was hoping at some point that I would get a chance to go. I started writing the book, or I started researching, reading bits and pieces before I went to Italy, trying to find as much as I could. And really, the newsreels I saw, those things were still confirming what I had heard. These stories of a David against Goliath, a poorly equipped military against a highly advanced military. And I went to Rome. I won a Fulbright. I was lucky enough and went to Rome. And I just assumed I was going to continue to find documentation for the book in my head that I wanted to write. I started going through the archives while I was there, listening to Mussolini's speeches, looking at old telegrams, reading, old letters, anything that I could find. And what was starting to become apparent to me was that the archives could tell me about maybe certain battles that happened, or when certain orders were given to do certain things. But they were also censored. This was also a curated history meant to uphold a particular narrative of a particular time. And I wasn't sure what to do at that point when I started realizing that, I had won this fellowship. I had moved my life over to Italy. I had made this big change. And yet what I kept finding was that there's something missing here, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Not long after that, I was on a tour with my first book. And I went to the south of Italy, to Calabria. And I was in a small bookstore and had given this talk of my book, my first book, set in 1974. And a man stood up at the end when it was time for question and answer and said, "I'd like to talk about 1935. And the entire room went quiet. And I remember when I had agreed to go to Calabria to do this talk, one of the reasons that I wanted to go was my sense of the Italian military in 1935, that the foot soldiers, the people who did the actual combat, came from the south of Italy. They were less educated. They did not go to the officers' schools to become the officers who gave the orders. They were the people on the ground. And I thought, if maybe there's a way to get to this history that way. So when this man stood up and said, "I want to talk about 1935, and the room got quiet, I felt that I understood the tension, maybe. And I didn't know what he was going to say, but I had a feeling it had something to do with somebody that was at war. And he said to me, "My father was a pilot in the war. He dropped the poison on your people. How do I ask for your forgiveness?" And he started to cry. And people there were telling him, be quiet, sit down. Why are you disturbing us? But you know, he put me a bit on the spot because people were looking to see what I was going to say, how I would respond to him. And the one thing I said to him was that I don't know what kind of forgiveness is possible just from me, but this conversation we're having is a step towards something. And he said, please don't leave. And he left quickly and came back. And he had what I'm pretty sure is just a self-published book, but he had his father's photographs, his father's letters from that time, his father's diary entries. And he gave it to me and he said, please do with it whatever you want. I came back to my apartment in Rome, realizing that the history that I wanted to tell was really the stories of the intimate and personal experiences of being in this war. That when I looked at his father's photographs and I was seeing men who were relaxing together, men in front of the airplane, you know, but men with, you know, writing something on the bomb that they were going to drop, but finding it funny. I said, this is the history. This is the story that I want. But how do I find this? How do I find more of this? I started going to antique stores. I left the archives and I started moving into flea markets. And the one thing I found out is at every flea market in Italy, there's like, you can for sure find a table for the Pope, and you can definitely find a table for Mussolini. So between those two, I would walk in and just start looking for Mussolini's head, because there's always something there. There's always a bust. And I would go for that fascist table. And I found somebody in Rome who was just fantastic. He was so helpful to me. I would go to him often and ask him, do you have anything? And he would bring out a box and he would say, take a look, or he would say, let me help you. And I would find these photographs, just daily shots of just quotidian life in Ethiopia taken by these soldiers. And at some point, because I got to know him pretty well, he took most of my Fulbright money. I got to know him well, and he would sometimes send me texts when new things came in. And I said to him, how do you have so much? Like, how are you getting so much, so many of these albums and letters and ID cards and photographs? And he said, when the men die, the families get rid of it right away. They don't want it in their house. So they look for him. I would start moving into other towns across Italy, Abruzzo, Trieste, Napoli, like smaller towns than that. And I would get one of two reactions. One would be like the man in Rome, who would really, you know, they would really help me take boxes out, stand with me and go through the work, and then sometimes just push me away. There were other instances where they didn't want me there at all. I often went with an Italian friend, so it was easy to just send somebody back to get what I thought I needed, or I thought I saw. But through this process, I started creating what eventually would become an archive, but at that time I thought was just a collection. I had been collecting randomly even before that, but this became very focused on photographs taken by Italians. I'd like to show you one of the photos that really changed things for me. And I hope everyone can see this, but this is a photograph that really emphasized for me the fact that these men carried their cameras. They were there not only to fight a war, but they assumed the war would be quick, it would be easy. And this was in essence an African adventure for them. They were there to document this. Soldiers like this man that I encountered in Calabria, that man's father may have never left Calabria except for this trip to Africa, to Ethiopia. Why not take a camera if you can? This may have been the first and maybe last time they would ever go so far. So men had their cameras. They were easily accessible at that time. They were not those big bulky things that we were used to from earlier years. And I think it became another way of creating memories for them. I had, let me just, I want to show you another photograph that I had that I think was very, really pivotal. And sorry for this, I meant to pull it up at the same time. I hope you can see this. This one for me, every time I look at it, it's powerful again. Sometimes people ask me where I got the title of my book, The Shadow King. And in some ways it's because of a character that is in my novel. That is Hirut. It's also Hirut, but it could be this other person that's name is Minim. But this photograph emphasized for me the role of photography in this war. This is a photograph of a man, an East African man. I believe he is maybe a prisoner, but I, of course, cannot know that. And here's this Italian man, and then here's the shadow of a person, of the photographer. It made me realize that no matter what image was being taken during this war, or no matter what image is being taken during war in a colonizing endeavor, what is actually being photographed is power and whoever the photographer represents. This photograph is not about this East African. It's about the fact that this man can stand next to him in his own country and be okay as an invader. It's about the stories that these two men will tell of their moment in this country, the stories they will take back home that will reflect on them. This story is not about the African. This story is about the Italians. It's about power. The minute that hit home for me, I began to see the camera as another weapon in war. And and I knew that Mussolini sent photojournalists to Ethiopia to create a narrative of Ethiopians as, quote, primitive or, quote, barbaric, uncivilized, so that the war could have a hint of a civilizing effort, a benevolent effort. That was already being started. This hit home that even the soldiers were curating their memories, were developing a narrative of benevolence, maybe. But there was another side to this. This man is standing with his arms crossed in a way that I feel protective of him. This man is not. He doesn't need to protect himself. This is a gesture of someone who is not quite comfortable. I've looked at this so often. This man has a bandage here. He might have been a laborer, maybe. He is a prop also to set off next to this this East African man. But the most important thing for me is the shadow of this photographer and the way that the photographer is always present in every photo that's ever made. As I began to collect more photographs, though, I started to encounter images that I couldn't quite explain, but headlines also. And I just want to show this to everyone. This is one of the first that I had. And this was, if you can see, let me make it smaller. But I started stumbling on a photograph of a woman with a gun in one of these soldiers' photographs, albums. I started seeing a reference one place or two places of a woman with a gun. And once I started seeing that in their own documents, I started trying to look for it more ardently in my research, stumbled upon this New York Times thing from November 20th, 1935. And that changed the book for me. That completely changed the focus, because I thought, if there's one, as a novelist, I maybe can say there's 5. If there's 5, I know there's 10. If there's 10, there's probably 50. I have since found articles I won't show here, but of a legion of women who enlisted in the military. But this gave me a sense that I could do something else with the book I was writing, but it also let me know that all these stories I had heard in my childhood growing up had never mentioned that role for women. I'll come back to that later, but that article and some of the photographs I found completely changed everything. I want to show you very briefly something that just came up for me 2 days ago, literally. I think, Lara, we were all talking about it just before this. And this is from a South African newspaper. Again, these stories continue to grow about the involvement of women. And that's how I know. And this is from a South African newspaper from 1936, April 25, a communist newspaper that was fighting against the racial segregation in South Africa. But the headline, "Woman Keeps Italians at Bay," is, someone sent me this yesterday. And the story here is just the most amazing. Again and again, the Italian snipers endeavored to kill the intrepid woman. However, without avail, however, for she kept well under cover. And it in some ways echoes for me that line that we said maybe a year or so ago about Elizabeth Warren, nevertheless, she persisted. But I keep coming to these stories, stumbling across these women, even after the publication of this book. I spoke recently with a historian, a woman who has done extensive research on this, an Ethiopian woman, Professor Tsahai Brahanu. And I said, there are like hundreds of women. I'm sure there are hundreds that were fighting in this war. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh no, there were thousands." So I think there's so many stories still to tell about this history. I have about 5 minutes, but the one thing I would like to say in closing is that Dr. Tsahai's comment, Professor Tsahai, "Oh no, there are thousands of women," lets me know that this history that I was working on, this history I thought I knew as a child, and even this history that I've written is just one narrative in thousands, if not millions, about this war. When I began this book, one of my first questions was to ask myself how I defined history. And I told myself that history is a series of narratives told by human beings who are fallible, who have their own biases, and sometimes just have bad memories. And within that space, I would tell my story. But in this book, I wanted to create a structure so that the voice of the narrator as history could have other voices speaking back to it and challenging it in some way. So that when Aster wants to say, or the narrator says, Aster did this and this, I wanted to bring in another voice, a voice of a chorus that says, actually, that's not the way it happened. This is the way it happened. Hirut doesn't want you to know X, Y, and Z, but we're going to tell you this. I wanted to look at history as a false narrative, because it's only one way of telling it. And how many other ways could I bring into the book structurally, if it could handle all of that? But how many other tellings could I put in here to begin to create maybe a prismatic approach to this moment in history? So the chorus comes in, which to my mind, they're the Asmari in Ethiopia, the storytellers, the singers that would put events, historical events, stories they would turn them into music and perform them for towns and villages and communities, and in that way cement oral storytelling as a kind of history. So I wanted to pay homage to that, and I incorporated photography as well into this, not through actual images, but through word images, as a way to allow my characters, or those people who were photographed, to speak back, in a sense, to the camera. I still think about that man that I showed you in the photograph with the shadow of the photographer. And I sometimes will stare at it, even now, trying to wonder what he would say if he could speak back. Yeah, I don't know, but he's still someone that motivates me to work with images, to work with photography in whatever way that I can. I'm going to end it there so that we can move on to the panel discussion, and I'm happy for questions after that. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Maaza. That was really so interesting. I'm sure our panel is ready to go. So the first question will come from Laura Benedetti.
Yeah, thank you so much for your novel, first of all, and for your presentation that gave us so many interesting and thought-provoking leads for this conversation. In fact, I don't know where to begin, but perhaps I'd like to start with a prominent feature of your novel. So the presence of strong epic and tragic undertones, right? For instance, one of the quotes in the epigraph is from the Iliad and reads, "Hereafter we shall be made into things of song for the men of the future," right? And as you just said, the narration also features a chorus, which, like the chorus in Greek tragedies, summarizes, describes, and corrects and comments upon the events. And when I read your novel, I also couldn't help but thinking of one of Italy's most famous epic poems, Torquato Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, Jerusalem Delivered, first published in 1581. And one of the most memorable characters in Jerusalem Delivered is a warrior woman, Clorinda, who then for centuries inspired writers, composers such as Claudio Monteverdi, painters such as Tintoretto. And now Clorinda is Ethiopian. Clorinda is Ethiopian. So there is even a beautiful article by David Quint titled precisely "Why Clorinda is in Ethiopian." So I was fascinated by this possible genealogy for your women warriors, and also eager to learn more about your use of these traditions, the way you adapt, and employ the epic, but also tragedy in your novel.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's, it feels, I wanted to work within the voice of the epic. I think, number one, in my head, this has always seemed like an epic. This is an epic tale, even the way it was characterized before a David against Goliath. This was a moment that involved a small African country, but it was world history. It would change the way that World War II was fought, because Mussolini would soon form an alliance with Hitler, but Britain and France were doing everything they could to appease him so that wouldn't happen. There was so much that was being fought in that battle. And I wanted to echo some of that never-ending tragedy that really stemmed from that. And frankly, as a writer, I wanted to challenge myself to write in the register of an epic, because it is exhilarating for me to read those. And I didn't know if I could do it, but I wanted to try. I was willing to fail at that. But I also found that moment that I quote in the front of my book from Homer, from the Iliad, is what it's Helen speaking to Hector. And that moment, it's almost as if she's resigned herself. She has become something that is territory to be fought over. She is a trophy of one man's vanity. She is the consequence of many men's vanities. She's a tragic figure, but she's created something, or it's not even her fault, but she will forever be connected to Paris's ego and Menelaus's egos and angers. She's tragic in that sense, that she's connected to something that was maybe, let's say, out, beyond her control at some point, and men died for this. I wanted to think about the place of women in this war. I wanted to think about those things that extend beyond war. Like, when war is ended, has it really ended? What war ever truly ends? And that's where, for me, that sense of epicness, the largeness and the tragicness was apparent in that question. And I wanted to create a form that could hold that. You mentioned Clorinda. I have to look at that. I was not aware of that yet, but I was thinking of Aida, and I was thinking of that opera, the tragedy of Aida's story, which to an Ethiopian, maybe looking at it in 1935, would be like a senseless death, because it's just plain stupid. Like, how would you do this? But I wanted to look at what happens to women in war. Those epics that we make into music, that we then cherish without actually thinking about what it's saying. And then these epics like the Iliad that we continue to love. I don't know if I'm fully answering your question, but the role of women for me was something that I wanted to explore in all its complexities, not just from the battlefield, but what happens when they went back into the military camps, when they moved from soldier to woman, and what happens after war, when you move from soldier to wife, back in the home. Like, the layers of that felt big, which is why I wanted to start the book in 1974, to look at the consequences. Hirut's body became territory for Kidana to try to claim, as much as the land that she was fighting, that the Italians were trying to claim. For Hirut, the war had many different sides to it. Enemy was not so clean cut. She was confronted with an enemy in her camp and confronted with the enemy, across the battle lines. And there was no real place she could be safe, because her body was under attack anywhere she went. And that sense of I don't know what the word is. It's not large. The magnitude of that reality felt epic to me, and it felt tragic. And I wanted to convey that in the tone of the book, and in the scope also that the narrative took. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I will go on to the next.
I'll try to keep my answers short. That was a good question.
Yeah, that's fine. So Nicoletta Piredu will ask next question. Thank you.
Thank you. So probably your answers to this one will be shorter because in part you have already addressed some aspects that I had in mind. I'm also lingering on form, which is one of the most outstanding elements of your exceptional work. So certainly your novel is entirely in the present tense, unless something escaped me, apart from Leo Navarra's letter to his son Ettore. And Ettore himself claims that there is no past, that there is no what happened, there is only the moment that unfolds. But as you have already shown us, the book offers a constant dialogue with the past, both the personal one and the collective, and does so precisely through an array of different genres, literary conventions, and media, which complement one another, but are also in tension with one another. We have mentioned mythology and the choruses, elements of the epic, but there are also traces of the Bildungsroman, the growth and the development of the main characters, interludes which evoke both the drama and music, the letters and the photos that you have mentioned. So in part, you have already addressed the idea of messages that this hybrid form conveys. But I was wondering, are there particular myths or stereotypes that you wanted to debunk by choosing to revise or to undermine specific genres? For instance, can we say that your use of form also helps you avoid the risk of representing a sort of Ethiopian exceptionalism with this glorious celebration of these events?
Maybe. I mean, I have to think about that. That's a really good question. The reason that I used present tense, the thing that was the most obvious reason for me, was that I wanted to acknowledge the fact that we are, all of us, constantly living both in the present and the past at the same time. The way that memory can carry such weight that our daily lives are always guided by it. I wanted to convey that, which was why I moved the book. I had a draft, an earlier draft that was past tense, and I moved it to that. In terms of pushing against this idea, a stereotype of Ethiopian exceptionalism, I wanted the presence of certain characters and the conflicts that existed within the Ethiopian camp to begin to reflect the myths, to reflect a reality that was opposite to the myths that I grew up hearing, which was that Ethiopians were all united, that all Ethiopians wanted the Italians out. But no one had spoken to me as a child about collaborators, about why they might want, to collaborate with Italians. No one spoke to me when I was growing up. No one, even now, has really addressed the numbers of people who were enslaved at that time. Like, we haven't fully addressed that as a nation. I wanted the narrative to begin that process. It is not going to do all of it. This is centuries of work that has to be done. But I wanted to reflect that reality through the cook, through Hirut, through people who said, let the Italians come, because whatever comes is going to be better than what we have right now. And so that was another way to include that. Thank you.
So next question comes from Lara Smith. Lara?
It's actually a perfect segue to my question, which is, you open the novel, as you mentioned, with Hirut entering Addis Ababa on the eve of the coming revolution of 1974. And that is I would note and is important, I think, for you, as you've just said, actually, I mean, is what I wanted to ask you about, in a country that really tends not to talk about the violence of that period very much, the violence of that revolution, and even less the violence of the Italian invasion and all these aspects that you've just now raised, quite frankly, very thought-provokingly. And I was really quite moved by the piece that you wrote for the London Review of Books very recently about the very recent conflict in northern Tigray in Ethiopia, and of course the sort of ripples of conflict in Ethiopia from that, and separate from that, sort of intersecting with that, if you will, but that particular conflict. You wrote about that conflict and tied it in with the fact that people alive in northern Tigray today would likely, some of them, remember and have seen or participated in the resistance to the Italian invasion, as well as the revolution, later periods of war, multiple periods of war in that region, and now this war. So I come to sort of shifting the gaze from Italy and the reception there, which I really appreciated hearing, and how it became, it shifted your focus in writing the novel to what the reception to the novel has been inside Ethiopia, particularly around any of these aspects of violence was actually more what I was interested in, but it could be any of these other themes: women's involvement in conflicts, inequality, any or all of the above. I'd be really curious in that broad question about what the reception to this novel has been inside Ethiopia.
Well, the book is now available there, and so people are buying it, people are reading it. The responses have been positive. They've been really positive. People have focused on the story of women. People have gravitated towards the character of the cook, who refuses to give her name because she is an enslaved person and everything has been stolen from her, but she's refusing to give them her name. She will not give that up. But there haven't been many discussions about her. There are two people that I don't get asked about. One is the cook, very much about that aspect. And the other is Fifi, who is the prostitute, or the madam. I don't know what the word is to call her, but I do not get questions on that ever. And I don't know if it's the nature of these women because of who these women are. I guess they're characters, but to me, they're women. I don't know why that is, but Hirut and Aster are completely glorified. It makes me think that we don't know how to have these conversations. I mean, having grown up most of my life here in the US, I have taken for granted the hard work that African Americans have done to create a vocabulary for race and racism and bigotry and all the intersections of that in this country. I noticed the absence of that vocabulary. I noticed it when I lived in Italy. It's just non-existent. And it has made me so grateful for the work of Black scholars, academics, writers who have enriched the way that I could begin to speak of myself in this country when I came here. We haven't had that in Ethiopia. That kind of conversation, it just has not occurred yet. How do we begin to speak of these populations as a nation? There are communities that speak, but how does that happen? How do we create this platform? I'm not sure. I'm not even sure I'm the right person. I don't think so. But I see that lack based on maybe just who gets noted in this novel. Yeah, but thank you for that question.
Well, fittingly, the next question is asked by Dayo Gore.
First, I want to just thank you so much for your powerful presentation and your really sort of engaging and rich and layered text. It's one of the first novels I've read of 2021, and it's been a real pleasure and actually a challenge, I think, for me. And I would just, I think, going back to your discussions a little bit of the relationship between history, memory, and narratives, I kind of, and also African-American scholars, because when I pick up the book, I'm trained as a historian, but an interdisciplinary scholar in African-American studies by choice. And I really thought about this work, say, of Saidiya Hartman and critical fabulation, or even the work, and obviously she's working in nonfiction, but thinking about how do you tell these quote unquote impossible stories like the transatlantic slave trade, and how do you tell them from women's experiences, which are so marginalized, or only narratives of violence in the records, or something like Toni Morrison, who takes this really celebrated case, the Margaret Grange case, and then writes a whole novel, beloved of it, to tell sort of this really, the interiority of that struggle, which I think you also do in your novel. And I'm curious, do you see yourself working in the vein of those scholars? And what do you think fiction allows us to do that history has limits on? Because I note in the acknowledgements you say, this is a work of fiction. So first off, and history is going to be used to that work of fiction. But I think also in your comments around the cook and Fifi and even Hirut, that you are also telling stories that, as you speak, don't ever really get told in the history books per se, or can't. Historians don't feel like they have enough to make a claim about certain experiences. And so I'm curious what you think fiction is doing for you there. Do you see yourself in this vein of these other sort of Black scholars writing sort of these almost impossible or stories people don't want to hear?
I thank you so much for that. Thank you for raising Saidiya Hartman's work. And Christina Sharp is another one. And Toni Morrison, they have, their example has really guided me and given me courage to move into spaces when I had moments of uncertainty, because there are so many gaps in these histories that I was trying to tell. I do work under the influence of Morrison. In fact, I'm reading Sula again now. And you know, Deb Willis and her work with photography and history is also someone that I am deeply indebted to. These women have been guiding lights for me, and I see that the place of fiction is really, we can't always, historians can tell us what happened, you know, there's that adage, but then fiction tells us how it felt. But there's also this point where fiction can begin to work. Fiction is not always just made up, you know. I mean, I know that there are people who work like that, and maybe that's one kind of fiction, but there's this historical fiction, and maybe the degrees of history to fiction and fiction to history change from writer to writer and book to book, and how we call something might change the way that we approach it. But I've become much more interested in books that now refuse to be called fiction or nonfiction, or instead just hybrid. And I've become really interested in the ways that these writers are saying, screw that, because you know what you know as history is my fiction, because I know something else that happened that you didn't write. And so I want to move even deeper into that territory. And I think it's an uncomfortable territory to move into, maybe for historians as well as fiction writers, but I am willing to move in further into that, guided by Saidiya Hartman, guided by Toni Morrison, guided by Deb Willis, Christina Sharp, and these women who are just, to me, like exploding boundaries of what's possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a little bit of time. So what I would do, if everybody agrees, is introduce a couple of questions from the audience, just because the fittingly and interestingly, the audience is asking about Fifi and about the cook. So I thought it would be interesting maybe for you to answer those questions. And then maybe we can go back to the panel and maybe back to the audience.
That's so funny.
Yes, so I'll read both questions. So Fulvia Musti asks, could you speak of the role of the cook in the novel? Why is she the only unnamed character? Does she represent Hirut's inner voice? And then Alison Jenkins asked, related to the plot and its relation and basis in history and Ethiopian military history, I was fascinated by the communications between the camps and the central role that Fifi plays as the spy in the Italian camp. Was her character based on something you learned during your research? Thank you.
That's great. Well, the cook was born with a name, but she refuses to give the name. She refused because she's an enslaved person who was taken from her village, sold to a family. Basically, everything was taken from her, and she refused to give her name. So she has insisted throughout her life to being called by what makes her useful to the people who that she works for, and that is a cook. She is a cook. So she's called the cook. I have sometimes tried to find out what her name might be in the process of writing, but nothing, every name I could imagine or try to guess for her resisted this character. And so I knew that she was insisting on remaining as she was. And the second thing with Fifi is there were many women like Fifi. There were many women who were spies who used their attractiveness or the attractions that Italians had for them, or the assaults that were enacted on them as a way to get back at the Italians. And so Fifi, what's interesting about Fifi is that she's doing what she needs to do and has no apologies about it, and is not necessarily a tragic figure. She's doing exactly what she wants, and she uses her position with Italians and Ethiopians to I don't want to give too much, but it's too late, to spy. Now you'll find out anyway at the very beginning of the book. But yeah, there were many women like her.
Thank you. So maybe I should go back to the panel and then we'll have another. There's just one question and two observations here. So shall I go back to you, Nicoletta? Or, well, in my order, I would have Lara again.
Order. Yes, I think.
Yes. Okay, Lara.
Oh gosh. Well, thank you. In a certain sense, I mean, my earlier question had partly been answered, but actually, something that you said prompted another question for me. So it came in your in your earlier presentation, and then in response to several comments about Professor Tsahai saying that there were thousands of these women. And it also sort of speaks to the method of literature and the method of history. So I also wonder if there's a place for sort of oral history inside Ethiopia, which speaks to the sort of silences in Ethiopia. If you think that there are these silences in Ethiopia about, I mean, was my other question earlier about, sort of what's spoken about, but if there is a need to sort of excavate some of this knowledge, if there's not from this room for us to sort of realize the gaps in our curiosity or our methodologies, and undertake more thoughtful historical work or other kinds of work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've always assumed that history is written, that, there's the primacy of the written word. And yet we're when we deal with communities that have often passed history through oral storytelling, we have to consider that as well. I wish that I wish that for every trip I took to Ethiopia when I was a child, I had a tape recorder where I could have just recorded my family talking or asked questions of people, and I didn't know to ask at that time. But I hope someone is doing that. I hope several people are doing it. But the stories of women, the stories of women who fought in war, were often told in the spaces where those women gathered after the war, which tended to be the kitchen, or tended to be, in a bedroom where sisters or friends would gather. And we've never thought of those spaces as containers of history, especially when it comes to Black women. And that's where that history still rests. And if there's anything, I would just challenge everyone who is listening here to go speak to your mothers, go speak to the women in your family with a tape recorder, and just listen to them talk and see what emerges and save it.
Sorry. My next person on my list would be Laura. Laura, do you have another question?
Yeah, sure. I have many questions, but speaking about the gaps in history, I think we can safely say that Italy has been slow in reckoning with its colonial past. And when I went to school, for instance, the topic was barely mentioned. Things are changing, though, I think, mainly thanks to a new generation of Italians, right, sons and daughters of immigrants, who see a direct link between their often marginal position in Italian society and the legacy of Italian colonialism. I'm thinking, for instance, of Ijaba Shego, whose family is from Somalia, or of filmmaker Fred Cuono, who was a guest of the Italian department just last week. And like in the US, this reckoning also entails a discussion about highly symbolic places, such as monuments, statues, street names, and the like, right? So for instance, most recently, just in summer 2020, the decision to name a new metro station in Rome, Ambaradam, from the name of one of the battles in the Ethiopian War, was overturned. And now the station will be named Giorgio Marincola. So the station will be named after an Italo-Somalian anti-fascist, right? So my question is, have you noticed a change? Have you noticed a change in this regard since the time you started your research for the novel? And what's your perception of the country's trajectory?
I think it has the conversations, thanks to Ijaba, thanks to Gabriela Germandi, thanks to Fred, thanks to Dagmari Yimmer, and all of these people who are writing and continuing to push the conversation. There has been so much that has changed. I think that Italians are still uncomfortable with this moment. I think that like in Ethiopia, there is a national identity that will suffer if all the uncomfortable realities of historical pasts are discussed. It is a painful conversation to have, but I think it's possible to do it. I do think it's possible to do it and actually to emerge much stronger. But I'm thinking right now of Laura, of the Montanelli statue that was in Milan, and that was this summer, and the uproar that happened with that. And I remember sending out a tweet that said basically, take it down, and I had no idea that all these Italians were going to come out. It was such a controversial thing. It's such a controversy because that history hasn't been dealt with yet, but it is getting better. And I am so completely grateful for people like E.G. and Gabriela, people I encountered when I first got to Rome, who helped me, just survive and make my way through the city, but also explained a lot about their own special positions living in the country, their own special histories there. And I think that, and I always would say this to Ijaba, even 10 years ago under Berlusconi, I would say there is hope in this country. There is real hope, and it comes from people like her, but and Italians who are invested in this work. And there's a new generation coming, so it's changing. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you also for sharing that. Your encounter with that man in Calabria, that was very powerful, very powerful.
Yeah, I will never forget him. Yeah, yeah, I still have that book.
Thank you. Thank you. So Deyo, you are next.
Thanks. I guess I'm really loving this conversation and really appreciating sort of the richness of it, thinking about between sort of these ideas of colonialism and nationalism. And I think someone in the chat had mentioned this as well. I loved your story about both this is a global history, right? That in part, and for African-American studies, we learn about this war as a part of sort of the battle against white supremacy and colonialism, European colonialism. And it is this grand struggle, right? It is this mythical story of an example through Ethiopia of a resistance to white supremacy. And people mobilize around it as such. And I loved your story when you talked about coming to the States and encountering people and then thinking of this history as your own way to sort of mobilize against it. But I thought in your book, you did a really impressive job, and I struggled with it myself, of having this myth, right? And keeping that alive where you could find heroic figures in that, but also in showing the everyday struggles, particularly of the women and the ways they exist outside of war, or that the struggles of violence, the class conflicts, the ethnic conflicts are still there, even as they unite against this struggle, which I think is such a tension in thinking about African diaspora studies, African sort of history, where those tensions are always there. And I wonder if you can talk about that sort of, were you trying to keep both alive? How did you sort of negotiate that in writing this story?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Dio, because it was really something that I was working on. I wanted to recognize those people who were often the farmers, the people that history tends to ignore, who did this thing that was absolutely mythic and heroic, which was rise up and say that even if a tank is coming after me, and I have never in my life seen a tank, it looks like a monster, I'm going to charge after it. I'll probably die, but I'm going to do it. I wanted to honor that while also recognizing all the tensions that existed within the community, if not all of them, at least recognize the tensions that still existed between Ethiopians. So I was trying to work on those two different levels. I think it was important to me because it was a way to acknowledge the deaths, the people who died, but a way also to acknowledge those who continue to live in the kinds of realities that they would encounter off the battlefield. That was as important to me as the other. So maybe I will stop there, but I think this idea of there's a diasporic conversation that has not happened yet. Consider, like, discussing some of the tensions that you've mentioned, like the ways that I don't know how often Africans and African Americans get a chance to sit down and have conversations about the 30s and what that was like in the United States, and then what that was like in Ethiopia or in Ghana and in Nigeria, or in liberation movements across Africa and the civil rights movement. Like, we haven't had that because I think that there is something to be said about those tensions that exist within communities of Blackness also keep us apart in terms of, you know, across the continent and around the world. I wanted to show a microcosm of some of those tensions within Ethiopia, but I hope that if there's anything, that there is opportunities through this book or through other things to that I write, to have conversations about what Black people, African Americans, were experiencing in the 30s and how that connects to what was happening in Ethiopia in the 30s. What was happening in the 1920s in United States with the like with the Tulsa massacre. We should be sitting down and having a conversation about that and the Addis Ababa massacre, and, you know, the effects of colonialism across the country and the effects of the Jim Crow laws, which were in essence meant to break the spirit in the same way. It hasn't happened, but I'm saying that to say that just because people have one commonality, I wanted to recognize the tensions and the gaps still that existed in between, and I see that on many different scales.
So we have a last question by the panel by Nicoletta Piredu.
Thank you. I wish to go back to the role of photography in the novel. It's very prominent and it's very thought-provoking. We see that apart from the two peritextual components of the book, the two pictures at the beginning and at the end of your book, all the sections titled photo provide, as you have already said, verbal descriptions of people and scenes of the plot, but they're never accompanied by actual images. I was intrigued by one element. In the descriptions, no matter how detailed they are, there is no reference to skin color. It's something that intrigued me. So I'm wondering whether it was deliberate. And always following along this line, we know that beyond the Shadow King, you have your own collection of photographs and other images, and they're also working at an archive on the Italo-Ethiopian War. And so I was wondering whether you can elaborate on that. I think it might be useful for the audience as well.
Thank you for that question. Gosh, you know, when I think about, I'm maybe two things. Number one, as a writer, I didn't want to write about skin color. It just feels, it feels almost irrelevant to me, but it's also a pushback against so many works that insist on naming someone's skin color first as a defining trait. But I know that the Italians would have noticed that. But I think that for Ettore, as a photographer, what he's concerned with is not the tonality of brownness. He's just looking at dark skin. And he eventually is looking at the contrast between light and dark, between the white clothing and the dark skin, but he doesn't know how to speak of color. He's just looking at how to balance that very rudimentary distinction. And that's where I kept it. It wasn't important otherwise for me. And my online, it's an online artistic and educational endeavor that I've created called Project 3541. It's up there on chat. It is a place where I will be posting some of my photos from my archival collection, but also I am inviting people from everywhere, if they have family stories connected to this history, whether Italian or Ethiopian or Eritrean or Somali or Libyan or Kenyan or Sikh, British, all the people that were involved, please share them. You can log on to the site and click and it will tell you exactly how to do that. Starting in March, I will be doing a monthly newsletter. So all those who would like to sign up, you can just go onto the site and subscribe to the website, and we'll be sending a monthly newsletter. The first one, I'm working with an extremely talented graphic designer who has her company called Yokeworks. She just showed me the work we were doing, the final thing, and it looks fantastic. So please sign up for that, and we will keep communicating that way.
Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. Actually, the question answer, there are a couple of things that I can read that are either questions or an observation, but some of them, Maaza, maybe you should look at because they are just saying how great your talk is and how happy they are.
Oh, okay.
There are people who are very happy that you talked about this history. But so there is a person who said it should be emphasized that this was the second attempt by Italians to invade Ethiopia. They had already been defeated in 1896.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes, that's true. And the anniversary, I think, is coming up soon for that war. Right.
And then there is a observation here by Laura Hartman Villalta. Amazing talk. Thank you so much. I work on the Spanish Civil War, and in the scholarship, there's a book about African Americans who go to Spain to fight, entitled "It Ain't Ethiopia, but It Will Do." In your antiquarian explorations, did you encounter evidence of non-Italian foreigners fighting in this war?
Yes, and I saw a very interesting documentary recently about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade that fought. Absolutely fascinating conversation, panel discussion with Robin Kelly just recently. But there were foreigners, if you call Italian-Americans foreigners, fighting in Ethiopia on the side of Italy. I have stumbled across photographs of some of them. They could go there, so they went, and I think they were often from New York or from New Jersey. African Americans, there were two that I know of. One was Hubert Julian, and he was there towards the beginning of the war. And then John C. Robinson, Colonel Robinson, was there for a while, I think until maybe 1936. And he would go on to start and help start the Tuskegee Airmen. So there were those, but I think the Italians had, the soldiers from Libya fighting as well. But in Ethiopia, I don't think until the very, very end, when the British forces came, that there were other people there, not in large numbers.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions, but then maybe I could ask you a question, which has been in my mind. So I was curious about the relationships among the women in your novel, because there's a lot of conflict, of course, going on there. So I think you show, on the one hand, there is a sense of unity towards the enemy. On the other, there is all this conflict around men. And so do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens in, there are women who understand that they're living in a patriarchal system, and yet what they don't want to move outside of that. All they want is to be part of that power, part of that system of power. And that is someone like Aster, who sees that, who's well aware of her own place as a woman in the world where Kidane is her husband. But she's also not very apologetic about the way that she treats Hirut or the way she treats the cook because of her social standing. And she doesn't want to lose that. She just wants more. And that is the reality. I mean, a good friend of mine, Mona El Tahawi, calls those women foot soldiers of the patriarchy. You know, we see them as those part of the rioters, the women that were the white women part of the rioters from January 6th. They don't want to demolish the system. They want to work within that system to subjugate other people. And that, I wanted to reflect that because that exists everywhere.
Thank you so much. We have another 4 minutes exactly. If anybody has a burning question, raise your hand or just ask it.
Oh, Dio has a follow-up.
Yeah, I just, what struck me in reading the novel was some of the points about these relationships among women, and particularly the point that the lasting physical scar on Hirut is from Aster's beating of her. And it's sort of, in the story, we return to, I guess, or Hirut returns to again and again, the violence that Kidane enacts on her, but not really, we don't get the same sense, or I didn't get the same sense that the experience with Aster gets that same treatment. It sort of happens and then you're on to another segment. I'm curious if you can talk about that choice and why that, even in the last scenes of the novel, is what she's trying to cover, that sort of mark.
Yeah, I think that there is still a part of Hirut. Hirut, as much as she understands that she wants to be out of this system that places her below Aster. You know, I think at some point Aster says to her, you were made to fit into the world. The world is not built around you. And she truly believes that. Even as much as she wants to be a soldier, she wants to do that. There's still this thing in the back of her head that there's still a kind of world that I fit in. It's not 21st century thinking. This is the thinking of a village girl from the 1930s who has no other example around her. And I wanted to stay realistic to that, even if it pained me a little bit. She feels that she stole. You're not supposed to steal. In some sense, she might have deserved this. Who is she necessarily to fight against Aster? But this idea of Kidane violating her like that for really no cause, someone she adored, who was supposed to be like a brother to her, is for her a real violation. Yeah, I hear you, Dio. I wish she would punched her out at some point, but I wasn't sure if that was her to do that.
But I think it's such a powerful in sort of structuring of how these long-term sort of hierarchies and sense of place are so much harder to undo or fight against. I just thought it was.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I had to think about that for a while writing the book, your question. Yeah, thank you.
Well, we are at the end of our time, so I want to thank Maaza very, very much. That was very interesting, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed it very much. And I want to thank all the panelists for wonderful questions. And so we'll let you go to teach your class.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you to all the audience members.
And
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.